Our app this morning is we find ourselves in Luke 12, 13 through 21, and there's a it's just a I think there's a really cool moment where Jesus gives us insight into the kind of life that we're invited into with Him. So this is Luke 12:13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do, for I have no place to store my crops?" And then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. So as you know, this is the passage we read uh, every Sunday before we receive the offering. No, I'm just kidding. But you know, it's an interesting one, and I think it's one that as we read it, especially as good North American uh, North Americans living in a capitalist democracy. We read this passage, and you see the actions of this man who has this rich man who has a who land that produced abundantly, and we think the actions that he does, like, what's wrong with that? Like, he had this like bumper crop. He grew more than he had anticipated, and so you know he expanded. And what's necessarily inherently wrong with that? And I think what's important to distinguish, and I remember hearing Michael Frost uh, reflect on this passage once, and it always kind of stuck with me. Um, but as we read this, like, I don't think this is necessarily an indictment against building wealth, right? I don't think that's necessarily what Jesus is challenging here. But here in Luke, there's something really interesting where um, in this passage, in the parable alone, right? The parable is starts in verse 16, and then in and it starts with this sort of reflection, or this rich man um, kind of going through what happens when he has this bumper crop. And in verses 16 through 19, there is this repetition in the text of this sort of look inward at that this rich man has. So in those few verses alone, you have 13 references to himself, right? He says he. If you could just go through the text, these references to this rich man, in this sort of like first person kind of way. There's he himself, I, my, my. And so here in less than three verses, uh, you have 13 references, 13 points at which the rich man places himself at his own story. He places himself at the center of his story. He places himself at the story of this rich crop. He places himself at the center, in many ways, of his own world. Um, and then, of course, at the end, there's this response from God. He says, "You fool, your life is being demanded of you." And then he says, "And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" Right? And so there's this response from God. He says, "Well, yeah, but now your life is over." And then, uh, to whom will these riches go? Right? They're going towards someone else. So and then Jesus wraps it up and he says, "So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves." Um, and so I don't think what Jesus is saying is that building wealth is fundamentally a terrible thing, but I think he does caution us against our tendency to see ourselves at the center of our world. Um, when Jesus invites us to something that's better, really. And in the center of our world, I think we're invited to not just have ourselves, but to have ourselves with God and neighbor. Um, so again, with this like repetition of he himself, I, like 13 times within 3 verses, like it's very clear what Luke is doing here is this sort of um, self-centered existence that this rich man was living in was falling desperately short of the broader communal context and communal life that he was invited into. And for us, we would read something like this, and it's in an individualistic society like ours. It's hard for us to really understand that, but um, the broader sense of kinship and community was so much more robust in the ancient world. And so I think it's you could make a very strong argument that the listeners of this parable, with this continuous repetition of he himself, I, they would sit here and listen to this and be so upset that this person would have themselves only at the center of the universe. Um, and I think Jesus it's a reminder for me this morning, and I invite you as well to be reminded that in the center of the world, of our world, of course, we are there. I mean, your life is your own life, but also being willing to invite God and willing to invite our neighbor into that center. Um, so at the center of our worlds, the center of our lives, we have God, we have our neighbor, and we also have ourselves. And that what that means is that the decisions we make in our lives, whether they're big decisions like what do you do with resources like your finances, or they're small decisions like how am I going to spend my day today. But the decisions we make when the center of our worlds, the center of our lives, aren't just occupied by ourselves, but they also encompass God, they encompass our neighbor. The decisions we make are done in consideration of this sacred community that we have, the sacred community of ourselves, God, and our neighbor. And that when we have all three at the center of our world, that is the sort of sweet spot, right, of living life following Jesus, that we have this consideration and decisions that are made in light of this broader sacred community. So may it be so today that we see the center of our world, the center of our lives, being occupied not just with ourselves, but being occupied by God and our neighbor, and that we, thank God, get to pursue this life with sacred community at the center of it. Amen.